A South Korean trade delegation is poised to depart for the U.S. this week for more technical talks on tariffs. Our foreign affairs correspondent Pei Eun-ji has the latest.
What if I told you that one of the most stable and long-standing alliances in the world today is on the brink of collapse? South Korea, which has been a loyal partner of the U.S. for decades, is now on the verge of an important choice. What happened? Why has one of the most predictable political relationships in Asia suddenly become so unstable? And what does this mean for the entire region and for the future of relations between the great powers? It all started with a trade deal between the U.S. and South Korea. At first glance, it looked like a normal trade concession. The U.S. would impose 15% tariffs on Korean goods in exchange for investment in the American economy. But there's much more to it than just economic agreements. It is a sign of how the global political map is changing and how fragile even the oldest alliances are becoming.
U.S. President Donald Trump on April 2nd announced a set of reciprocal tariffs on major trading partners, including South Korea, before putting a temporary pause to those levies for 90 days.
South Korea, one of America's most reliable allies in East Asia, is unexpectedly changing course. Its historical attachment to Washington, which has been the foundation of the country's security and prosperity, is beginning to crack. It all started with one event that no one expected. Then when the U.S. took tough measures against migrant workers, including South Koreans working in the U.S., it was not just a political decision, but a real insult. This moment became a turning point. It struck at the very foundation of mutual understanding, leaving South Korea with a sense of humiliation and discontent. But the most interesting part is just beginning. As it turned out, behind closed doors, South Korea began to look for alternatives to the U.S. These were not just economic negotiations. Countries with which Seoul had not had close ties until recently suddenly began to attract attention.
Bessent also noted there are 18 important trading partners that the U.S. is most focused on solidifying deals with, while adding that there are a lot of smaller trading relationships. As the deadline looms, he said Washington may impose some tariffs by region rather than on individual countries.
China, which had long been perceived as a major rival, now appears to be a potential ally. And these are not just words. South Korea has begun cooperating with China, discussing ways to minimize losses from U.S. tariffs and expand joint projects in strategically important areas, such as rare earth metals and electronics. But that's not all, as South Korea has begun to seriously discuss the possibility of moving beyond its traditional alliance with the U.S. The country is no longer one that always follows Washington's instructions and is now asking itself, is America still a reliable partner? And if Chinese markets open up, who would be willing to ignore such an opportunity? What does this mean for the U.S. and its ambitious strategy in the Pacific region? How will other countries react if South Korea chooses a multipolar world? After all, this is not just an economic deal. It is a signal to the whole world that the old rules of the game may be revised. What will happen next with South Korea? Will it remain a loyal ally to Washington, or will it decide to take a new course? This question remains open, and its answer could radically change the political map of East Asia.
And we have, at the same time, 150 countries that want to make a deal, but you're not able to see that many countries. So at a certain point over the next 2 to 3 weeks, I think Scott and Howard will be sending letters out, essentially telling people, it would be very fair, but we'll be telling people what they'll be paying to do business in the United States.
In September 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a new trade deal with South Korea that attracted worldwide attention. The signed agreement provided for the introduction of a 15% tariff on all goods coming to the U.S. from South Korea. This move was part of Trump's broader strategy aimed at redistributing world trade and securing economic benefits for the U.S., which, according to him, had been lost due to previous agreements. Under the deal, South Korea also committed to increasing its investment in the U.S. economy, specifically by purchasing $100 billion worth of LG products. However, this involved not only goods, but also significant capital investments that were intended to stimulate the development of various sectors of the U.S. economy, including technology and manufacturing. At first glance, this agreement seemed quite beneficial and balanced for both sides. The U.S. received promises of investment and a reduction in the trade deficit, while South Korea gained the opportunity to continue its supplies to the U.S. market under tariff restrictions, which could have a positive impact on its own industry. However, there was a much more complex political background behind this agreement.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Even as Trump signed the agreement, experts began to predict that it could mark the beginning of a significant change in relations between the U.S. and South Korea. Since the 1950s, South Korea has always been one of the United States' main allies in East Asia. For many years, the country has maintained close economic and military ties with America. Seoul supported Washington's anti-terrorism strategy by participating in various international operations and remained a key link in the system of deterrence against China and North Korea. All this time, relations seemed unshakable, with minimal signs of crisis. However, after the introduction of the new trade agreement, the atmosphere began to change. Within a few months of the deal being announced, the first signs of discontent began to appear in South Korea, gradually escalating into a full-blown political crisis. The previously unwavering support for the U.S. and its policies began to be questioned, and the Korean media began to wonder whether they had become too dependent on America and whether it was time to look for new opportunities for development. Unlike their older generations, Korean society has become more critical of the U.S. Young people who grew up in the midst of the technological revolution and globalization began to discuss more openly the need to diversify foreign policy. The South Korean elite, including politicians and business people who had traditionally been oriented toward the U.S., now began to seriously discuss the need for South Korea to seek more independent paths of development without being exclusively subordinate to Washington's interests. The key moment was the incident involving South Korean workers employed at Hyundai factories in Georgia. When Donald Trump announced that these workers had stolen jobs from Americans and then decided to carry out mass deportations, it was perceived in South Korea as a real insult. For Seoul, this was not just a decision on migration, but a clear insult affecting not only the economy, but also national pride.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Hyundai's factories in the U.S. symbolized a strong bond between the two countries, and suddenly that bond was under threat. Soon, South Korea felt that it was being perceived as a secondary player in the world, and this moment became a turning point. Korean diplomats and politicians began to openly declare they were no longer willing to put up with such treatment, and this began to affect all aspects of their foreign policy. One of the main questions that began to arise in Korean government circles was how long the country could continue to follow the path laid out during the Cold War, when South Korea was completely dependent on U.S. military and economic support. Less than a month later, signals began to emerge in Seoul that the country was starting to look for alternatives in China. This was a signal of a possible change of course that could affect the entire dynamic in the region. As an economically developing and high-tech country, South Korea could not ignore the opportunities offered by the People's Republic of China.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
With its growing economy and powerful influence, China began to appear not just as a threat, but as a potential ally. At the same time, Beijing was active on the diplomatic front, offering South Korea new economic agreements that could compensate for losses from U.S. tariffs and open up access to new markets. This involved not only goods and services, but also strategic partnerships in sectors such as rare earth materials, electronics, and even space technology. An important point in these negotiations was the fact that South Korea began to openly consider options for working with China to create a new financial mechanism that would allow both countries to circumvent U.S. sanctions and tariffs. This was more than just economic cooperation. It was a signal that South Korea did not intend to be tied to only one of the two major players on the world stage. It soon became clear that South Korean officials were beginning to distance themselves from the U.S., emphasizing the importance of forming a balanced foreign economic policy that would satisfy the country's interests. Serious discussions began in South Korea's political arena on how to avoid dependence on one country and strengthen its position in a world dominated not only by the U.S., but also by China and Russia. In this situation, South Korea felt that America would not perceive it as an equal partner, but only as part of its global strategy.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
In response, Seoul began to seek more autonomous paths of development, strengthening ties with other Asian countries, and even considering opportunities for cooperation with Moscow. Thus, the trade agreement signed with the U.S. became not only an economic step, but also a turning point in South Korea's politics. It became a catalyst for change, leading to a gradual cooling of relations with Washington and a desire to pursue a more independent course in international relations. Shortly after it became clear that South Korea had begun to rethink its relationship with the U.S. and a possible shift towards China became more apparent, one important detail continued to exacerbate the situation. Tensions between the U.S. and South Korea increased significantly when reports emerged of closed-door meetings between senior diplomats from Seoul and Beijing who discussed not only economic cooperation, but also political rapprochement. Although neither side officially confirmed these meetings, the leak of information from the Korean Foreign Ministry caused considerable concern in Washington. It was reported that these closed-door talks discussed mechanisms to protect against U.S. tariffs, which could form the basis of a new format for interaction between Korea and China, despite their historical differences.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost. They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Such diplomatic rapprochement between South Korea and China inevitably raised a number of questions about the prospects for regional security. For decades, Seoul has remained an important strategic partner for the U.S., encountering Chinese and North Korean influence. But now there's a sense that South Korea has begun to seek a balance between the two powers. And while economic issues may have seemed secondary at first glance, their political significance has become apparent. Soon, reports began to emerge that South Korea had begun to look for ways not only to compensate for losses from U.S. tariffs, but also to develop long-term plans to create mutually beneficial supply chains with China in high-tech areas, such as rare earth metals and electronics manufacturing.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Thus, despite South Korea's official position that the country was not violating its obligations to the U.S., it was in fact building closer ties with China, which was seen as a clear political signal by Washington. When the South Korean president publicly declared that the era of unquestioning dependence on the U.S. had come to an end, it sounded like a loud challenge. In South Korea, not least because of growing public discontent over the economic difficulties caused by trade wars, more and more people began to advocate for political and economic independence. Generations that had grown up in stability were now beginning to realize that the American ally was not an eternal guarantor of their well-being. More importantly, a trend emerged in Korean politics toward attempts to find the optimal path for cooperation with global players, without focusing exclusively on one of them. In this context, China appeared to be a natural partner capable of providing markets and resources that could compensate for the economic losses from U.S. sanctions. In addition, it turned out that one of the factors that accelerated Seoul's shift towards China was the growing climate of discontent among Korean youth, who were becoming more inclined each year to pursue a more balanced foreign economic policy.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
While the older generation continued to view the U.S. as an unwavering defender and economic partner, young people began to see China not only as a competitor, but also as an important economic player. In a social survey conducted in South Korea, more than 60% of young people said they believed it was possible for the country to develop without heavy dependence on the U.S. This was a clear reflection of the shift in public opinion, which was gradually moving away from the traditional alliance with America. Economic reforms in China, industrial development, and the reduction of trade barriers with the PRC were becoming increasingly attractive to many South Koreans, especially entrepreneurs interested in expanding their markets and increasing production efficiency. These sentiments were reinforced by the actions of the South Korean government itself, which began to actively seek ways to strengthen economic cooperation with China. The country began negotiations on the possibility of participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which posed serious questions for Washington.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Direct participation in Chinese economic projects would be seen as a clear violation of the principle of strategic commitment to the U.S. This was particularly sensitive against the backdrop of reports that South Korea had also begun to actively work with Russia, which in turn added another element of uncertainty to the already complex relationship. Experts spoke of a new multipolar approach in which South Korea became part of a global game where it would not have to choose sides between the two great powers. Such steps came to be seen as a signal that Seoul was willing to take risks to maintain its economic stability and independence amid global trade wars. Meanwhile, pressure was mounting in Washington in response to South Korea's growing closeness to China. American politicians began to express concern that Seoul might violate general agreements on military cooperation and intelligence security. The U.S. Congress did not rule out that South Korea's new course could lead to the loss of key strategic positions in Asia, which in turn would weaken America's influence on the security of the entire region.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
In particular, a number of American military experts stated that if South Korea continued to move closer to Beijing, it could jeopardize American military bases in Korea and even weaken the U.S.'s defensive positions in the region, which would have far-reaching consequences for global politics. However, South Korea did not back down. All these changes took place against a backdrop of internal economic instability, which was partly caused by trade wars and sanctions. The country's authorities began to realize that by remaining heavily dependent on the U.S., they risked being left on the sidelines of global changes. In this situation, strategic rapprochement with China and even Russia seemed not only logical but also necessary to maintain economic stability. According to many experts, the South Korean elite understood that in a world where trade barriers and economic competition are becoming increasingly fierce, finding new partners is the only way to maintain strategic independence and ensure sustainable development. At the same time, voices in South Korean politics were increasingly calling for the country to abandon its former role as a junior partner to the U.S. and rebuild relations in line with the new realities. Public discussions on television and in universities focus not only on economic benefits, but also on political autonomy. Young people focused on globalization and mutually beneficial cooperation saw South Korea's new path as an opportunity for development, unlike the old political structures, which continued to believe in the need for unquestioning support for the U.S. Thus, the same course that the South Korean president began to chart in relations with the U.S. could be seen as a strategic maneuver aimed at creating a more balanced foreign economic policy that would reflect the country's growing ambitions on the international stage. South Korea continued to take steps that clearly indicated its desire to rethink its relationship with the U.S.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
One such step was South Korea's tacit agreement with China's actions, while the rest of the world expected a harsh reaction to the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on Chinese goods. In response to the escalation of trade conflicts between the U.S. and China, South Korea not only failed to support Washington's position, but also expressed its support for Beijing at the diplomatic level. This move was seen as a sign that Seoul was not ready to follow in the wake of U.S. policy and that its view of global politics was becoming more multipolar. The South Korean government refrained from directly criticizing China's position, but it was clear that Seoul was putting its strategic interests first. Experts believed that this silence was not just a diplomatic strategy, but a serious hint that South Korea was ready to adapt its policy in response to changing conditions. Although the U.S. continued to be considered South Korea's main military and political ally, China's growing influence on the world stage and the potential economic benefits of cooperation with China were now seen as important priorities.
Well, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
South Korea made no secret of the fact that economic ties with China were becoming increasingly important to it, despite its previous orientation towards the U.S. In addition, there were rumors that several high-level delegations from South Korea had already visited China to discuss participation in major Chinese infrastructure projects. This was the strategically important Belt and Road Initiative, which significantly strengthened China's influence in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. South Korea, not wanting to be excluded from this economic network, began to openly consider strengthening ties with China, despite the potential consequences for its relations with the U.S. It is important to note that publicly, South Korean officials continued to assure Washington that their country remained a loyal ally, but behind the scenes, There were increasing signs that South Korea was ready for a new political and economic reality. However, the situation became increasingly tense when South Korean politicians began to openly declare the need to revise their U.S.-oriented foreign policy in light of changing global realities. As a result, against the backdrop of these changes, the country began to publicly express its dissatisfaction with American threats and sanctions.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
For example, a number of prominent economists in South Korea openly criticized U.S. interference in their economy and politics, which only exacerbated the differences between the countries. These challenges grew with each passing month, and it was clear that the traditional foundations of the alliance between South Korea and the U.S. were gradually losing their strength. The U.S. responded with accusations and threats. The American administration began to claim that Seoul's double dealing was undermining trust between the two countries. In particular, Trump publicly stated that if South Korea continued to develop relations with China, he would be forced to review not only trade agreements, but also the terms of military cooperation.